Welcome to Lega Office Hours. I'm Christian Lang, the founder and CEO of Lega, a platform that helps visionary law firm leaders safely explore generative AI. I'm here with our CTO, Rob Sacconi, and we've had three of our favorite thinkers and doers from the industry stop by to dive into the topic that people can't stop talking about this week, DeepSeek's open source, open weights R1 model that's really kind of taken the world and the internet by storm. If you're actually watching this video, you probably know them already, but we have with us Nikki Shaver, who's the co-founder and CEO of Legal Technology Hub and also an advisor to Lega. Michael McGinn, Senior Manager of Artificial Intelligence Solutions at Fasken. And Conan Hines, Fried Frank's Director of Practice Innovation and the best damn TikToker working in the legal tech industry. So our goal for today is both to level set a little bit about the issues swirling around and as a result of the R1 release, but then go a bit deeper than the LinkedIn hot takes and actually have a meaningful conversation about the impact and the implications of R1, if what's happening is all about this specific model, or perhaps we're going to be talking more generally about what the model represents and it's not about this specific model. And to get that ball rolling, I would love to hear from Michael and Conan in the law firm trenches, answers to kind of the following. I mean, based on your current understanding, you're all learning as we go here, right? But based on your current understanding, what is the most significant thing from your perspective about this R1 release? And relatedly, what's the most important open question you have in your mind right now that you feel needs answering? Either one of you dive in, whoever's eager.
I'm happy to jump in. So I would say the most significant development in this sense is this. Again, as you mentioned, this is still very early stages, so we don't know everything, and we're absorbing quite a bit at this stage right now. And as we all know, also that whether it be LinkedIn or anything else online, there's a lot of announcements of the next big thing, and wow, this is incredible, and so certain things get kind of lost in the noise, so to speak. And even initially, let's say like the first day or so, I somewhat dismissed it that it was just another, a significant development, but maybe not one that I needed to pay attention to immediately. But the reality is, it is an incredibly major milestone when it comes to open source LLM development. What we now have is a model that is world class at OpenAI O1 model class that has open weights. That is essentially downloadable. You can run it from your own tenant if you wanted to. And it hints at least, the ability to essentially commoditize large language model usage globally. So that removes the need to use closed system services and some of the major players out there in the marketplace. So I think there's a trend there. Now, whether R1 specifically is that model, or if it's a derivative model, and we're already starting to see some from Hugging Face, for example, earlier this week, and a few other announcements, and I'm sure we're going to have quite a few, because the initial paper, the research paper about how they trained this model had been released, and a lot of people are actually utilizing that to actually create their own similar models. I think that is the significant development at this stage right now. So I'm paying very close attention to it, because from a compute cost and just an overall operations cost, there may be a lot of advantage of using these, not only just from a law firm perspective, but I would imagine from a legal tech vendor's perspective if they're utilizing large language models.
Yeah, no, it makes good sense. Is there like a burning open question in your mind that you're still trying to get answered about it?
I think, to me, again, it's hinting at democratized AI access, right, and large language model access. But there are risks, and we've seen a lot of those in the news as well. In fact, DeepSeek just had a major security breach that was announced, a couple of days ago as well. So all of this is happening within a 7-day period. So risks with security, compliance, and governance, I think, are major. So will this ultimately push firms, back to just sticking with those proprietary closed systems? Or will they pursue a direction of maybe a hybrid approach, or maybe look at some of these alternative models if they're not necessarily comfortable with R1 on their particular servers, but maybe and we're already seeing developments like, for example, R1 is now available in Azure at this point. So I have a thought of which direction it's going, but the jury's still out.
Yeah. All right. We'll put a pin in that point about the model proliferation or not, or closed or open. I want to come back to that. Conan, what's your take?
Yeah, what I find fascinating is that we've moved from actually a lot of firms haven't yet, but I mean the idea is we're moving from on-prem systems into procuring all sorts of different solutions as a service. And what I'm now wondering is, are we going to kind of go back into the old world a bit, or maybe some will stay in the old world a bit when it comes to this, and say, how much are we going to build a capability in-house to host these AI models? And it's more apparent now than ever. You need to have expertise in what's going on. We're not going to sit here and likely build AI models, although that might even get closer and closer to something in the coming years of being a possibility. But the fact is, why would you consume a cloud service with added security risks, even if it is in the Azure tenant, when you can buy some very affordable hardware, stick these powerful models on them, and run them on electricity? And when we talk about the scale, that's gonna, I would think, serve you well from a cost perspective. So that's what I find fascinating is how much, and what I see in some, I mean, some law firms do it differently from an innovation team perspective. I think I'm probably a little bit more on the unique end, where we do the AI application development within my team. We have an engineering team. That's part and parcel. We are buy and build group. Some innovation teams and law firms don't have that component. They're out there. They're pretty much at the whim of whatever's out there available on the market, and they can procure as a service. So I think there's going to have to be some reckoning with how the collaboration between the engineering side, which you should have as a mature organization, and the innovation side, and the buy build from like an infrastructure perspective becomes, I think, just a real question. So I wonder how law firms are going to think about the kind of talent they need to bring in, and the kind of investments they are willing to make in order to realize the future.
I think those are great observations, and I'm fascinated, regardless of which strategic perspective you're coming from of the two you just teed up, like how you do it in the face of the pace of change that we're experiencing is a really interesting question that's obviously near and dear to our hearts. All right, so Michael, you like really clearly said, which I think a lot of people would strongly agree with, that this is a milestone moment. But what I'm actually quite interested in is, like, I'm not saying that's wrong by any stretch of imagination, but what is it that made it such a conspicuous milestone publicly in people's minds? Like, what was that? Nikki, more than probably anyone else we know, you have your finger on a million pulses. Legal Tech Hub is kind of is the crossroads for the legal tech and innovation marketplace. Like, what's your gut? Like, why was this such a big and conspicuous development
But it's
for
the
the market?
it's the performance of the actual model itself, right? And so this is the first time we've actually seen a freely available model that competes with the very top tier, best frontier models that are out there currently in the marketplace, that you can deploy on your own tenant. And so this opens up a whole new game of commoditizing large language model usage, globally again, right? And so I think that's a major development. We've seen similar approaches, and there are, other major players that I wouldn't say necessarily open source models, but are moving a little bit more in that direction and have developed some great models. But this is definitely a significant one. in that sense, right? And so I really, to me, when I'm thinking about it from a long-term perspective for law firms or any type of organization, this certainly opens up a lot more opportunities of cutting those operational costs. But also the security items that Conan mentioned earlier. Potentially having it on your own tenant allows you to have much more security. You can refine these models to your own specific needs, whether it be jurisdictional or whatever it may be. There's quite a bit more flexibility with these open weight type models. Yeah, I mean, there are a million different things that makes this really exciting, but I think that's the key point there is just the power of this particular model.
I think
Nikki,
that's
what's your
right.
sense based on your perspective? Yeah.
Yeah, I think just from a layman's perspective or layperson's perspective, there were all kinds of things that made this really notable. It was from the app itself, the DeepSeek app, has been downloaded a ridiculous number of times, I think 2.6 million times or something. And it is the most downloaded app in the United States, which is crazy when you think about this is an app that comes from China. In the political climate of the day, it's kind of an incredible timing, right? Like you have the whole TikTok fiasco, and then DeepSeek, the app, is rises to significant popularity above anything else. And it's not just in the US, by the way, it's in 51 other countries as well. It's the #1 most downloaded app. So that in and of itself, I think, raised the notoriety around this story considerably. And then, of course, the NVIDIA stock plummet. So, like on all kinds of levels beyond tech itself, it was just noteworthy for the general public, I think. But Michael's right. Obviously, the reason that it is downloaded so many times is because people are curious. It's supposed to be so powerful. To have a model come out of China that rivals OpenAI's o1 is pretty significant. And of course, you had Mark Andreessen actually call it like the Sputnik moment of generative AI, which is kind of cool as well. So I think all of those things have come together. I think for people who are in tech and in legal tech, then it remains interesting because there are all kinds of quandaries around it. I mean, it's an app from China, and someone said on LinkedIn, well, we shouldn't have just a knee-jerk reaction because something is from China. Of course. However, the terms and conditions around DeepSeek's use when you're using it as an app are concerning. They allow for the capturing of data, including personal information, not really in compliance with data regulations in a lot of countries, including the US and especially Europe. We know that the Chinese government has regulations that also allow for the government to step in and grab data from companies like this. So it is concerning from a data perspective and a data privacy perspective. On the flip side, if it is really true that it's been able to be developed with less computational, with less reliance on NVIDIA chips and that kind of highly expensive, rare commodity, then that's significant for the engineering community at large. And it speaks to not just this particular instance, this particular release, but how the trajectory of generative AI is likely to unfold in probably the very near future. Plus, it has environmental consequences. So there are so many different reasons why this is a really major thing. And for me, it is important as well, I think, to talk about the app, because when we think about OpenAI and the release of ChatGPT, we very quickly had Mata versus Avianca. We had these cases where lawyers relied on the app version of the technology in order to query the law. And if people are doing that with something like DeepSeek, it layers on top of that type of hallucinatory risk, also risk around privacy, especially when it comes to client information and that sort of thing. But then I think it's also fascinating to think about what are the potential consequences if this type of quality generative AI product is able to be produced at a significantly lower cost And what does that mean for firms, not just building, but also buying technology? What are the questions you need to be asking your providers? Do you need to be pushing for open source technologies to be used in combination with other technologies? Do you have wherewithal now to push for costs to come down? Should we be expecting costs to be coming down as other commercial providers start investigating the types of methodologies, training methodologies that DeepSeek used and which they've also publicized? So lots of questions.
So many, and there's so many great things to pick up on there. Rob, I want to get you involved because I mean, brilliant people all on this call. You are the most deeply technical person who is closest to the ground on like what's actually happening in the model community. And it's interesting, like on one hand, very credible sources like Mark Andreessen are calling it a Sputnik moment, which implies certain things about this coming out of left field and being, surprising. I've also heard rumblings from people I trust who are citing researchers and things saying, no, this is right on track with what we were expecting and where it is. And we've had models about advancement that are showing this is exactly where we're supposed to be right now. Like, what is actually the reality? And from a technologist perspective, who does this every day, he's like in the weeds every day. I don't know. How do you react to those threads that Nikki just put on the table? Like, what is it that we really need to be focused on here with R1?
Well, first, I agree with everything said, right? And there's so much to unpack, and I have a million thoughts on this. But I think the most interesting developments here are a mix of some breakthrough changes in actual architecture of how these things work, right? It's not ironic that we're a mixture of experts on this call chatting about models. The mixture of experts architecture used in this is different than other models. Basically divides up the work to make it more efficient, to grossly oversimplify it, right? So there are some like data science and like software engineering advancements that we can take advantage of. But let's face it, like the last couple of years, there are a lot of people who are like, standing on the shoulders of giants and, deeply like expert researchers and academics and have found a way to take it to market. And it's not ironic that OpenAI, for example, is like threatened by open space AI, right? So I couldn't agree more that like the combination of technology advancement in this, the combination of how the models are trained and sort of tuned into being something very useful, like that is also different in this, but it's not new, right? They used a different reinforcement learning technique. The reasoning part of it, like the way O1 works, so that's closed box, like OpenAI doesn't share how that works. These guys put it out into the open, and it sort of shifts a lot of the workload to inference time instead of like supervised training and other things that were very, very, very expensive to do. Like, so all these things add up to like radically reduced cost, but nothing net new per se. But that cost, like, there's a lot of debate over the, what did they say, 5.5 million or $6 million to build this model? I don't care, right? It translates into the cost to us. And because it's open source, the guys at Hugging Face are replicating sort of the full pipeline to reproduce this model, including the training data, including the reinforcement learning techniques, right? I couldn't agree more, Michael. It seems inevitable, like this fully commoditizes the model layer of this whole thing. And it highlights that the app layer is where people will win. And OpenAI's valuation at what, $300 billion or whatever it is today, like, come on, like a lot of that is based on information disparity, right? People don't know how to do this stuff. Suddenly we do. Like, or at least we have the tools available to more people. So that's like a huge moment in time right now. I think some of the other pieces of it are like the elephant in the room or the panda in the room, like running DeepSeek on your phone. And so like, I just wouldn't do it. I mean, that would be my recommendation. But because it's open source, it's sprawled a whole slew of access points and ways to use DeepSeek today, like which we jumped on pretty quickly, right? And Michael, you mentioned Azure hosting it. It'll be interesting to watch the Microsoft OpenAI DeepSeek triangle you know, over the upcoming weeks and months. There's a lot of legal concerns. But at the same time, Microsoft seems to be continuing to double down on their OpenAI relationship. I don't know if you noticed the Think Deeper stuff from yesterday and the last couple of days. That Microsoft apparently is making O1 available for free to Copilot users under this Think Deeper option. They've also released instructions on how to run distilled DeepSeek models, which distillation is a whole other super interesting but somewhat technical topic. But it lets you take all the big stuff that they figured out using different techniques and shrink it down into something even more, you know, efficient to run. And they gave instructions to run it on Copilot Plus machines and on their hardware, you know. So yeah, so much more. But I'll stop there a little bit because I think the punchline is that we've got new technology and new approaches available to us now to radically reduce the cost. But you're right. Will that increase consumption? Will it create more usage even at a lower cost? Like, good question.
Yeah,
it's a bad thing.
I want to pick up on that. Michael, I know you just put out a blog post on that and kind of how the Jevons paradox speaks to this context. So I want to get into that. And maybe related to that, I want to tee up. A number of you have mentioned the effect of commoditizing in the model layer, this sort of development. I want us to actually unpack that a bit for people listening, because I think somebody who's not in this every day could be forgiven for thinking, oh, well, that means I'm just going to go out and find a good model that's the cheapest one I get my hands on, and that's all I need is that. And do we think that this means that it's kind of a race to the bottom of the model side and they're all going to be the same, or does it mean that it's going to democratize the models and there are going to be lots of models doing different things that are running in different places at different cost points, and which have very profoundly different implications for how we need to manage them as an enterprise if that's what we want to do? How do we understand commoditization in this context as a result of this development? And while you think about that, Michael, do you want to speak to the somewhat unintuitive reality that maybe making all this easier and more efficient might actually lead to like a lot more usage?
Yeah, absolutely. And so there's been quite a focus on this, and this is something in the sustainability space has been discussed quite a bit when it comes to any efficiencies in technology or energy consumption or resources. But it's Jevons paradox, which, I don't want to get too pedantic here and necessarily, go down the professor road. But essentially what it is the idea that, there's this assumption that when a technology or a resource becomes more efficient, that's actually going to drive down costs, right? And that's understandable. I understand why we would think that. But the inevitability is that is not necessarily the case. It's that, in fact, resource or the demand goes even higher. And thus the cost in some instances actually go higher as well, because now more and more players are using this technology in times when they may have not used it before because of the cost prohibitions and whatnot. So there is a bit of a paradox that we have to work through there. And, quite frankly, I don't know how this is going to play out necessarily. But, touching on one of your points as far as like, the democratization of what that may potentially mean, is I do think it means a lot more models. I think it means more domain-specific models potentially, and I think there's a lot of advantage to that. But from a governance perspective, that becomes very difficult as well. So there's a lot to navigate there, and I wouldn't say I'm necessarily the expert in all of that, to say the least. But it is a significant paradigm shift in a different direction, and the earlier we start thinking about these things, I think the better.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's a related paradox of choice that creates, right? Because, and even a paradox of sorts where if the cost of trying these models, like win or lose, to perform certain tasks, to solve certain problems goes down, it's pretty likely more people will try, right? It reduces barrier to entry. And even despite the open source and like free label on DeepSeek R1, it is anything but free if you want to use it at scale, right? It's one thing to like Conan, your comments were interesting on like build versus buy when it comes to infrastructure, right? I think that's what you're saying. Like, would firms host their own farms of H100s or whatever and be running big models. Well, you know, I can tell you from experience, my vast experience with DeepSeek over the last 5 days, running individual experiments with smaller versions of DeepSeek, you know, like distilled models and so on, you can run that on your Mac and, you know, do some interesting things. Running that at scale, you know, for a few thousand users in a law firm or anywhere, completely different challenge. You know, I'm just spitballing, like guessing here, but like you probably need, you know, eight plus, you know, like high powered GPUs with terabytes of RAM and so on to get the response time that your typical partner asking a question and waiting for an answer would wait for, right? And you know, that's, you know, $8-10 an hour of GPU time, like it adds up fast, right? So not quite free, but it's safer for sure, right? But even with that cost coming down, right? To really bring that cost down further, it forces people to make choices about the specific problems they're trying to solve with any given model. And then that opens up the choices of, well, which model would I use and how can I make that model serve that particular purpose better? And we've observed, you know, Christian and I, all of us really, that we're not there yet in many cases, you know. AI is a feature, it's not the product, right? So trying to figure out where that feature plugs in, like what problems can this solve, has been pretty much the name of the game. Now, some people have solved some very interesting problems. But if you take a very, very specialized model in theory that can run on, you know, fewer resources, fewer costs, lower environmental impact, like all the benefits of that, forces you to be much, much more specific about the exact problem you're solving. Otherwise, it's not going to solve it very well and you're back to where you were, right? So there's a paradox there, or at least like a chicken and egg thing, like problem, solution. But then the choices that creates, like as specialized models appear, suppose a series of distilled R1 models are created that are focused on a specific type of contract in a specific part of the review process, hypothetically. And you see the first one, then the second, then the fifth, then the 10th, then the 100th model that does that. How do you choose which one? And that's the other challenge we have today, is like evaluating subjective output, right? Benchmarking it, very, very difficult, particularly when it comes to legal work, I think.
Well, kind of, I mean,
so yeah, I'll leave those things out for thought, but yeah, I think there's a lot to it. Like there are many, many potentially conflicting choices we're all facing now, and like, how do we move forward with this stuff?
yeah, but so as somebody who has to propose a budget, Con, and like be accountable for the money the money spent, like how do you think about that? And just to put another gloss on it, just come at it from another angle. What do you think what does this mean for the people who cut massive checks last year to, you know, that were making big bets on certain certain specific implementations or certain specific theories of the case about that, you know?
Yeah, I mean, we're in the world of renting products, I think, at this point, and not saying, okay, we did that, we bought it, and we can now just keep it running for the next 5 or 6 years before we have to revisit. And it's just, I mean, the agility you have to have is very difficult. I mean, I'm literally in budget mode right now, and trying to predict what's going to happen in 13 months, let alone 4 months or 5 months, is quite difficult, and depending on how restrictive your finance team is and how much you can move money is important. But you know, I never thought I'd be thinking about the CapEx budget, but of course we are thinking about it more. And you know, for right now, and I appreciate what you're saying, Rob. I mean, I you know, and I don't think, you know, you're running everything locally for your firm, and you know, if our firm was getting value at, you know, every person in every seat across, we would, in some ways that's a good problem to have. And I take your point that we're not there yet from an internal hosting, but I have to imagine it's a step toward what, you know, the latest innovations could bring for us. But yeah, I mean, right now, I mean, there's plenty of reasons why you can just go and use your ChatGPT account right? And you can still use that, or probably not the DeepSeek account, but there are going to be for me, I think it's really prescriptive in how we're going to use it. It's for legal tasks, it's for serving the client, and I think it'll take us a while before we really start hitting our entire firm using it every hour on the hour. But I do take your point. Yeah, I don't think we're there where most firms are gonna build out that capability.
Conan, can I ask
yeah, please.
I want to come back to something that you said earlier, Conan, where you essentially inferred that this particular release made it more clear than ever before that firms have to have their own engineering teams and need to be building. I'm curious about why that is.
Well, for me, when I talk about building, it's not necessarily pushing production applications out to the business. I mean, we very much view us as an R&D team first, and we prototype and we build widgets and we test them out. And at some point, we believe the market will cancel out the need to do that, and we'll move on to the next thing. It really is actually more of a procurement, like risk mitigation strategy, in that I myself included, right? I might be the least technical person on this call, but when Gen AI first came out, I mean, I was listening to every podcast I could get my hands on. Fortunately, I do have really smart technical people on my team to rely on. But I remember one of the first fascinating concepts I never heard before that apparently has been around for decades is the mixture of experts. And so kind of to the earlier conversation around, did this come out of the blue? Well, no, not really. I mean, this is a paper that was written back in the early 90s about how and that was literally what smart people were talking about. Like, that's probably what's going to happen. Someone's going to be able to use, almost sort of like an agentic backend to distribute and almost like load balance the queries coming in. So just for that, Nikki, I mean, if I can go off and I can build something that looks like this product that's going to charge me a high premium, then I can go, well, I can just do this here. Again, not that I would do it, but I'm like, why are you charging me so much when I can literally, spend 2 hours and get very similar performance from my little widget? And to me, that'll have a ripple effect across all these, thousands of AI vendors who now really have to think about their model. And it really comes back to, you can't be a general AI company. You have to pick a domain, you have to pick a use case or a few, and you have to target that. And we, as a firm, we figure out integrations and interoperability. How are we moving the data? How are we connecting data in the background? And less so on, we're going to build like production level legal applications and bring that to our user base.
Yeah, I agree so much with all of that. But one of the things I want to bring it back to the pace of change, which I'm fascinated by. Nikki, maybe this one's best for you, because I mean, you've worn a number of important hats in your career, but you've run innovation and KM and important like buy side functions at some of these like top law firms, and then now you're a vendor and you've sold into these, and so you get to see it from both sides. What is your level of optimism? Like, how do you think these enterprises as they exist today, and maybe they'll need to be remade, will the incumbents of today be able to respond effectively and appropriately to the pace of change here of this technology that is theoretically existential for knowledge work? Like, what's your, now that we've seen it play out for 2 years, what's your take?
That's a really interesting question. I mean, I think some of them will and some of them won't. Honestly, I do think that we are getting close to a point where we're going to see a little bit of fallout and some firms that simply are not able to keep pace. And there will be real ramifications of that. I don't think we haven't seen that yet, though. So it's when people ask about what's the timeline around this change, what is that really going to look like? What they mean is to your point, Christian, like, will some of these organizations need to be remade? Are clients going to start talking with their feet? Will there be real pressure to adopt across the whole organization and really to change the way we think about pricing and value? At the moment, what we're seeing is firms investing and still looking at it as iterative change rather than profound change to the way that people work and the way that they offer services to clients, although that is starting to happen in pockets. And I think the pockets it's happening are the firms that probably are on it and recognize that, profound kind of business model change is likely coming, and they want to be there when it happens. But I do think, around the pace of change, one of the problems is we're seeing pilot fatigue. So the firms that are uh, not perhaps playing in the R&D well to the extent that Conan and Michael's firms are, but are instead piloting off-the-shelf technology. I love that term, renting the technology, because that's effectively what they're doing.
I stole it from O's, I think.
You did? Okay. Well, I'm going to use it online, so I'll make sure to credit both of you. But when, they're not signing long-term contracts because of the pace of change. But the trouble with that is you're introducing new technology to people all of the time, which means people are having to relearn, retrain. That is not sustainable. But I think the pressure needs to be for those that are renting or buying technology. The pressure needs to be on technology vendors to keep their architecture model agnostic and to allow for new models to be brought in as they are released. As new, better, cheaper, more effective models are released, they have to be built into the product so that firms don't need to swap in and out, but instead it's the vendors that are doing that.
Yeah, it's great. It interacts very well with the point that Conan was making. I mean, we need to be able to disaggregate the value being created by the foundation model that a vendor's reselling potentially at an exorbitant markup with something they're doing that's bringing true domain expertise, application layer optimization for a workflow, et cetera. And I love this conversation. We should make it part of a Lega ad, because it literally is like one of the very unexpected sales pitches I keep talking about with our platform is like, if you're going to go spend $1 million on something, why don't you just prototype a simple version of it first in something like Lega and see if it works and see if people will use it. Shelfware has always been a problem in our industry, but when the tools cost $1 million, like, it's a much bigger problem than it was when you're buying a $30,000 tool. Yeah, 100%. All right. I know we've been talking for a while. We should probably wrap it up pretty soon. Why don't we feel free to chime in if anyone has a different way they want to close, but here's something that could be fun. Does anyone have either a hot take about this stuff that you think is worth sharing, or maybe even more constructively for the people who are listening, a hot take of someone else you've seen that we're not trying to shame anybody, but we're trying to help the community learn here, that you think was kind of a little bit misguided, where we should nudge in the right direction and kind of change the thinking that we've seen, percolating on the social networks. Now that we've had this interaction, had this conversation, what's the thing for people to take away and think about, or thing to think differently about? Does that make sense?
I'll do one quick take,
Yeah.
and I just think I mean, the T's and C's of DeepSeek might have be the least consumer friendly of all the public AI services. But what I hope that doesn't detract from the fact that probably doesn't matter. You shouldn't do certain things with any of them. And it just gets back to basics. And so it's not a spicy hot take, but I think it's the fact is, and I've said this before with my loud mouth on LinkedIn and maybe other podcasts, that we really have a great ethical foundation in the practice of law. I think education's great, but this is Google, right? You don't put client information into Google. You shouldn't, right? You shouldn't have done it with OpenAI. You definitely shouldn't do it with DeepSeek. So I hope that people aren't, like, as a fallback option thinking, oh, I'm in good graces with OpenAI because that's the safer model. And it's incumbent on people like Michael and myself and things that you guys are building, Christian and Rob, to bring that safe, secure environment to the users, whether it's our own or third parties.
Amazing point. And I'm going to drop a quick product plug here because it's important. So last year we had a customer who was incredibly proud of their training regime, that users had to go through live training. They had to sign a bunch of certifications. In context, before they used tools, they had to acknowledge how policies applied and what they couldn't do, and they were prohibited from putting certain data in models. And when they went back and did a formal audit of the logs, of the history of what actually went in and out using our kind of like audit log functionality, they saw about 15% noncompliance, notwithstanding that training. So I couldn't agree with you more. We also need to think about how monitoring and policy adherence tooling needs to be set up to help, not to be big brother, try to shut things down, but to help shape a responsible journey and continually train people to kind of make the best and highest use of these things in the right places. Anyway, quick product plug. All right. Rob, Michael, Nikki, what you got? I'm looking for a spicy take from somebody. Come on.
Oh, this isn't spicy, unfortunately, but I'm going to jump on what Conan said, because I put out a post with the T's and C's so that people would be aware. I think a lot of people took that and said, you should not use DeepSeek ever. That is absolutely not what it means. Similar to what Conan said, you should actually be looking for your vendors to be leveraging new, better technologies, more efficient technologies. The key issue is, if you're using it on an app, be careful about that. I wouldn't, frankly. But secondly, if your providers are using it, ask about it. Like, double down on your questions. How are they dealing with data? Make absolutely sure that your data is not traveling back to the foundation model provider. So that's the takeaway, right? The takeaway is not absolutely never use this technology.
Which is an important nuance that is lost on people who may not do this every day. So thank you
Right,
for
right.
underlining that. Very important. Michael, Rob, what you got?
Oh, well, I wouldn't say spicy either. Not at this stage. Mainly still kind of processing things. But again, I think I would really reiterate the fact that I personally do not believe, and I think we're all kind of of the same opinion here, that this is not just a one-off milestone. This is a significant shift in a new direction to democratize this technology. And so I think that's an important thing to keep in mind when it comes to any firms that are now just getting into the game, is to kind of define their strategy around at least embracing this or learning more about it. This will change the industry across the board, I think, to a large extent. It's going to force big players like Anthropic and OpenAI to really not only build even more advanced models and release them quicker, but also probably focus a little bit more on the application layer as to what they can do with these models, which they haven't necessarily had to have focused on as much in the past. So I think there's a lot there on that side, but that's really the thing, right? We have so much noise out there in the marketplace about the next big thing, the next big model and whatnot, but I think this is a significant shift. And so this is one that I would definitely encourage people to pay attention to, much like a little over 2 years ago when GPT-3 was released.
Yep. 100%. Rob, you got one?
I have a tip and some food for thought. The tip is that like, building on your comments, Nikki, and literally on your post, like when I saw it, I was like, God, that thankfully somebody is like pointing out that they need to be careful and look at this. But there is a path forward for people who want to experiment with DeepSeek and not give their data to the PRC. Like, that is, go through other providers, because remember, this is open source. The model itself doesn't have a phone home feature. And if that model is running in a safe provider, now you still have to do diligence on the provider that you choose. But there are ways to do it, where I have seen the reactions you're referring to, Nikki, where people are like, whoa, like, ban access to DeepSeek. Well, there's DeepSeek, the application that you can download, and then there's the capability that DeepSeek provided to the open source community, and people are taking advantage of. Not all of them will take advantage of it in the safest way. And another plug, like, we jumped on that by researching and choosing a few different providers. This is before Microsoft opted to host DeepSeek. I wouldn't say that is the safest way either, but it's better than going to deepseek.com. And try to make that available for those who wanted to experiment with it, but it's buyer beware always, right? The food for thought is something I've been stewing on for a while, and it really came home for me with this, the introduction of these reasoning models. When I was running the process improvement consultancy at Sci-Fi, I had on my team a dozen process experts, Lean Six Sigma black belts, and we sat through dozens, they even more than me, dozens and dozens of process mapping exercises with the practitioners, with the attorneys. And in many cases, we got to such a level of detail where we were able to map out by the minute the process of, for example, single plaintiff employment litigation through motion for summary judgment down to the second, like we, hyper fine-tuned process. Very difficult to produce those artifacts, even more difficult to like consistently use them in the day-to-day practice, but invaluable. Like even just the learning for me to get into the heads of the users, which is what we all try to do as software, product creators, right? So keep that in mind. Then think of this reasoning chain of thought trend and architecture change and learning techniques that are being used in these models to create better models and better results. You're instructing the model how to break down a problem, how to think about the problem, how to decompose it step by step, and perform the right tasks at each point in time to achieve a result. Is that different than the process mapping? Then take that and think of just prompting and prompt engineering. It's a bit of an art and a science, but at the end of the day, the more context and detail and instruction and examples that you can give a model, whether it's a reasoning model or it's, a mini model running on your Raspberry Pi, right? Like the better quality prompt you give it, which includes describing the process to solve the problem, right? If you give more detail, more instructions, more examples, like, really put up the guardrails for it, right? Is that any different than the process mapping, except that it doesn't require process mapping skill per se. It doesn't require special software, process mapping tools, right? You're verbosely, declaratively describing the process to achieve an outcome. And in my experience, like some, not all, attorneys are very good at understanding a complex legal problem, breaking it down into the constituent parts, even delegating those pieces to people, to a mixture of experts, right? There's more than a parallel there, in my opinion, between all of those things. I think there's a convergence coming with app layer, model layer, being commoditized, meaning we can use more models for more things at the same price or less. We can stitch it together with better software to make it work, right? But at the end of the day, it does come down to a fundamental understanding of how problems are solved, and that's very domain specific. And we have a lot of really smart domain experts in our domain. It's Colin, to your credit and to teams like yours, I've always looked at teams like yours as those who match solution and problem and translate for the practitioners, which is a really hard job, But if you can do that, and then you can just explain to some robot, like how to get the problem done, and it does it for you, like that's game changing.
Yeah, I want to add a quick thought to end, and then we're going to close it. I'm sure people have to run the meetings. But Nikki, you said something earlier that I completely agree with, which is this is the year we're going to start to see separation in commercial impact of the people who have been on the ball and have been working. Like that first 2 years where the change is less than you would expect, we're kind of through that now, and we're about to start to see it diverging. And it dovetails very much with what Bob was just saying, what Connie was just saying. Our legacy processes are too slow. Like we can't do this the old-fashioned way and have the innovation team own everything really tightly. And like we have to find a way to get more people involved in exploring and figuring out in the domain layer what they need and how this works. So I want to encourage people, even if it's not by way of buying Lega, you need to figure out a way to create the safety you need so you can take the reins off a bunch of diverse explorers who can all go in and start tinkering and playing and find the way that we need to transform the way we deliver legal services. Because if you don't, I firmly believe you're probably going to be out of business in the next 5-10 years. Anyway, that's my hot take. Thank you all very much. I'm sure you have meetings to run to. This was Lega's initial, inaugural office hours. It was a blast. Thank you so much for joining us. Hope to have you all back and talk to you soon.
Thank you.
See you guys.
Thanks, everyone.